All right. We're back here with another BPI webinar, and today we've got a great guest with us. We've got Yaël. Yaël is a consumer and technology advocate, journalist, writer. He's also serving as the deputy director at the Consumer Choice Center, and recently added as a full-scale fellow at the Bitcoin Policy Institute after a visiting fellowship. So really excited to have him today. Yaël, welcome to the BPI webinar series.
Thanks so much for having me, Zach. Pleasure to be here.
Cool. All right, we got a bunch to cover today, but before we dig in, I want to just get into your background a little bit. Can you tell us sort of who you are? Maybe you want to dig into your role at the Consumer Choice Center. You could talk about your BPI fellowship. You go wherever you want with this one.
Yeah, sure. So, sort of my day job is I comment on public policy and advocate for consumer choice. Started that really back in 2017. Before that, I had been a journalist, worked at newspaper, television stations, online media, investigative journalism, and getting into advocacy was just something that was very natural for me. So, 2017. A couple of friends of mine, we launched this new organization, Consumer Choice Center. We wanted to advocate for particularly millennials who like cool technology and like freedom of choice. So they like things like Uber, and they like to have legal cannabis, and they like to have nicotine pouches, and they don't like the government interfering too much in technology and financial privacy. So that's kind of how we got started doing that. I'd always been pretty interested in Bitcoin. You know, I was in this kind of classical liberal libertarian world doing advocacy as well, and basically learned about Bitcoin from Free Talk Live, this old radio show that was in New Hampshire. I think it's still on the air. And Roger Ver was advertising a lot about Bitcoin back then. And then once I had moved to Europe, got to know a lot of Bitcoiners here in 2012, 2013. And that's when I really started getting a bit more interested in that. I was writing a lot about Bitcoin just for my own columns and articles, interviewing politicians who were accepting Bitcoin, figuring out the best ways to use it. What were the platforms back then? We did not have as much choice as today, but glad to see it's evolved. And I think like around 2018, 2019, there was a sort of more discussion about policy and Bitcoin. And I thought that was really interesting. And we obviously had everything with altcoins and the whole, blow up and everything that happened afterwards. And that's when we figured out that there would be a really good avenue to talk about cryptocurrencies and Bitcoin, more specifically from the angle of decentralized technology and financial innovation. And basically, that's when I kind of put my head down, started writing about what are the cryptocurrency policies that are impact at the state level and at the federal level. How can we be sure that we have good rules that allow consumers to buy this, use it in their everyday life? And it was really in that I kind of got hooked in with Bitcoin Policy Institute, writing about this at the state level, and then some of the concerns more from a user perspective, less sort of academic. I'm not a very smart philosopher, but I do know a little bit about public policy and how it impacts Bitcoin and broader usage. So that's kind of what I've been doing for the last couple of years. Background as a journalist, I think, is very important for folks to know, because that's essentially how I got a lot of my training and understanding how to research this stuff. But from then on, I'm on the Bitcoin train.
Cool. Yeah, I feel like once it gets you, you're hooked, and I think especially having that sort of writing background fits nicely with what we're doing at the Bitcoin Policy Institute. I think we sort of see ourselves as an educator in the space, with a fairly targeted audience of policymakers, but nonetheless, the writing element is really important. Okay, so I feel like just to kind of foreground our conversation today, the sort of battleground that most of the issues that we're thinking about are sort of on the peer-to-peer rights element of Bitcoin, sort of Bitcoin as it was originally intended. And I want to kind of, again, foreground that with you here. So what do you see as sort of the essential elements of Bitcoin as, a freedom technology, a sort of locus of innovation? What is the basis of Bitcoin as a technology?
Yeah, I think the basis of it is just that you have a peer to peer network where people are able to exchange value, and they're able to do that without anyone's permission. So it's permissionless and very open source in that anyone can run a node. Anybody can poke through the code if they know what they're doing. But even if they don't, they're able to run it on their own computer, their own servers. I think even now I've got in my office here the humming of computers, your various Bitcoin nodes running at one time. And I think that's really what it comes down to, is that I have an empowered piece of a alternative parallel financial system right there at my fingertips and under my control. And especially if I have my own keys, that means I'm able to take my value and give that to whomever I want. So I have this sparkly new haircut. And earlier today, I went to my barber, turned around. He offered me a QR code. I scanned it and I sent him Bitcoin. Nobody else was involved in that interaction, just me and him. No banks had to be called. There was no credit card companies that had to be looped into what I was buying. My information wasn't doxed to anyone. And I think that's the most empowering part of particularly the Bitcoin network and everything that we're doing. And then it's also about figuring out, now that we know that this exists, that people are able to interact peer to peer as they have been doing for thousands of years, what does this new technology allow us to do? What allows us to do it across borders, and allows us to do it across regimes, different currency types, different continents, time zones. And I think that's really emboldening a lot of people, and people are very excited about it, using it in droves. It's true that you have this Bitcoin momentum, and then you have the kind of larger in the background crypto momentum. But all of that, I use the term a lot in my writing, crypto offspring. I think it's important to note as Bitcoiners that you had Bitcoin, which is our sort of original invention from Satoshi. We have all the developers who worked on that, the longest chain. And then we've had the crypto offspring that have aimed to either emulate Bitcoin or offer something different to Bitcoin. I think Bitcoin gives us a more wholesome view of what this technology brings and why things like self custody are important. But I think at the same time, when we're talking about policy, we have to understand that a lot of people are going to engage on this topic thinking of those crypto offspring. And I think that's why it's also important to discuss the differences between Bitcoin and some of those others. Something that can't be controlled, something that does have a hard supply. These are not things that you're going to find in your normal, whatever token, fart coin, or even Ethereum. And there are a lot of changes and different ways that some of these other projects and tokens and protocols are centrally controlled. And that's one great thing about Bitcoin, is that even if someone accumulates way more than I might have, they have no more control over the network than I do.
Right. I think another thing to hammer into here that you discussed, and using the barber example, which I love. I need to find a barber who will accept Bitcoin, but there's this sort of privacy element to Bitcoin, and I think there's certainly a debate to what extent Bitcoin is actually private. Um, but to the other extent, the system that we're living in is highly surveilled. The traditional banking system is sort of an offshoot of government surveillance. And so, yeah, I guess the question here is, like, to what extent does Bitcoin offer a solution to privacy? Does it even in the first place? And how are we thinking about that?
I mean, Bitcoin definitely offers you pseudonymity in that you are able to kind of interact as a either node ID if you're using Lightning, or your XPub if you're using on chain, but you're not going to be fully anonymous if you're using on chain Bitcoin payments. That is a trade off that we have with everything being transparent and having a large public ledger that everybody can write on, everybody can verify on their own node. That is a kind of trade off. There are other protocols and other tokens and coins that kind of do offer that base layer privacy. But I think for us as users, we want it to work, and we also want to be sure that we're able to use it and not have any guardrails or things stopping us from using it. And there have been many attempts we've seen with blockchain analytics companies of flagging particular wallets or transactions. We definitely saw it in my own native Canada with the trucker protest, that there were various xpubs, wallets, addresses that were tagged. They weren't frozen because obviously the government can't do anything about it, but if people were moving coins to an exchange using that address, then essentially they were put on some list and they would have their other accounts shut down. So I think one thing to think about for Bitcoin privacy is that a lot of the innovation that's happening is addressing that. I'm a big fan of silent payments. I think it's really interesting. I think Seth for Privacy had a GitHub page with, some of the people who put money towards us getting better technological solutions. And I think I have to pay some developers 100,000 sats at some point because I think it's great. But I think that is really interesting. What Lightning has been able to provide, something like Arc that is coming around as another layer 2 solution, could be very interesting. So Bitcoin has offered us just this wonderful plan, this kind of architecture whereby we are able to exchange value and do so over borders in a decentralized way, peer to peer. And it's up to the innovators to come up with the better privacy solutions. There are things you can do now. Obviously, using Lightning is a very good way to do it. There's a lot of great Lightning wallets that you can have on your phone, on the computer, and people are using that. I mentioned the silent payments as I did before. There is CoinJoins that has, obviously something that we've discussed a lot at Bitcoin Policy Institute when it comes to Samurai Wallet and to the different interactions and whether or not that runs afoul of the current law. But I think this is still very important. Cash is still something that is legal, not in places like Scandinavia and the like, where you can barely pay with cash anymore. But for most of us, we're able to use cash and do so anonymously. And you're absolutely correct that the banking system has basically been turned into a huge financial surveillance, panopticon. And banks are deputized by the government to file reports on all of their customers, seeing where all those transactions are going. Bitcoin does not have that, a kind of entity where they're having to do so, but many custodial solutions will face a lot of those regulatory questions. And I think that's something that we should be advocating against in figuring out good policy solutions so that we can restore some level of financial privacy and to be sure that people can use the Bitcoin network and not be fearful that their transactions will be doxxed, that they'll be reported to their local dictator, or in the case of Russia, if you have donations that you're sending to the Navalny campaign, which are then sent to Putin and his cronies. This kind of underscores why this stuff is important and why people should get to know the technology, and we need to support those that actually provide those solutions too.
Right, right. Yeah, we're going to talk plenty about Bitcoin, but I want to kind of go further down this thread of, um, you know, technology and how it's regulated on the sort of privacy front. And I think something that's popping up right now is the COSA, Kids Online Safety Act, that's I believe in the Senate right now. Um, and this obviously is not directly concerning Bitcoin, but it does concern the way that governments are thinking about regulating privacy, particularly on social media. So, do you want to give us a brief overview of that? And then, I think the goal here is to kind of loop this back to Bitcoin. So, how can we think about sort of the precedent that gets set here if this were to pass and what that would mean for Bitcoin?
Yeah, and I think this is a kind of underreported issue, and much like pretty much every legislation, it has a name that has nothing to do with what it's actually about. So, kids' online safety has nothing to do with this bill. What this bill is intended to do is to introduce liability to any social media platform, and essentially, if they allow teenagers to get on the internet and to get social media accounts, that's at the heart of it. And basically, what the government does in this bill, if it were to pass, thankfully we're kind of holding it off for now, but if it were to pass, it would mean that every social media network would need to, under penalty of law, figure out if you're a minor or not. Well, how do they figure out if you're under 16? Well, they have to ask everybody in the platform. And how do they confirm that? Well, they have to figure out who these people are, how old they are, and what kind of information we need for them in order to prove that. That means that social media companies are going to be required to get your personal data and to determine your date of birth. Now, the bills, they've been a lot of back and forth, and now Elon Musk is apparently in favor of this, which obviously I don't doubt, because if anyone uses X and is part of the blue check crew, and I happen to be one of them, you have submitted your own ID in order to get your blue check and all the benefits that come with X Premium and the like. And I think what's happening in this particular scenario is you have many of these technology companies, social media firms, some of them do this anyway, right? They're still trying to figure out, particularly if you're doing targeted advertising or something, you're still going to have to prove your identity at some point. But what COSA does is it makes this mandatory, and it sort of brings in what I call the plaintiff attorney model of you allow anybody to sue them, you allow basically any state to come after them, and you make it so that the social media companies are just going to basically become like our banks, and they're going to be deputized by the government to figure out who's online, if they're a minor, and there could be speech concerns. There have been a lot of modifications to COSA. It's gone back and forth. People like Jonathan Haidt have been pumping it up as a great thing because it finally gives parents an avenue to keep their kids off the internet. But that's kind of the problem. It has nothing to do with parents. It has nothing to do with parental consent. Myself as a dad, I will not be empowered to help my child figure out if they're going to go on this social media website or they're not. It's the government that will be enforcing that on the social media companies. So it takes away the parental rights and also does away with the online anonymity that, number one, was central to Bitcoin's founding and much of its development. And also, two, is tantamount to free speech. One of the most important things that we're able to do, much like the American founders did when they wrote the Federalist Papers, is to use names that are anonymous, put it out into the ether, debate ideas, and not have the fear that the government will repress you based upon that. So I think that's what COSA really tries to inject into our society right now and is absolutely relevant to Bitcoin and the broader conversation about how the government is trying to regulate both the internet and then broader technology as well.
Right. Yeah, I think, just the way that you describe it, it reminds me of, the Bank Secrecy Act and the way that the banks are regulated. Um, so I guess, that is our next topic here. You wrote a recent piece for us and for the Bitcoin Policy Institute that you were critiquing the Bank Secrecy Act. I think the title was, reforming the Bank Secrecy Act would be a powerful reform for Bitcoin. Um, can you dig into that a little bit more? I'm curious, sort of, there's some current legislation, Senator Lee's Saving Privacy Act. What's kind of the first step here, and what might that mean for, a return to Bitcoin's sort of, um, peer-to-peer and original nature?
So I think one good way to examine the Bank Secrecy Act in its modern form and how it impacts us, there was a recent report by the House Weaponization Subcommittee. And if you're hanging out on C-SPAN, you know what I'm talking about. But in this report that was put together by the committee, they essentially went through how the Bank Secrecy Act is being used and abused by many different law enforcement and federal agencies. So, what the Bank Secrecy Act requires is that banks, financial institutions, and money transmitters are required to send off a suspicious activity report if you send money that's over $10,000 if it's a traditional bank, or over $2,000 if you're a money transmitter. Money transmitters, think cryptocurrency exchanges. Now, these reports are put into a central database with the Department of Treasury, and these are searchable by all agents of the federal government. And it's estimated, I think the report said, by about 20,000 different government workers and contractors. So they have this database where they can look at any transactions that are made by a particular person in a particular amount on a particular day. The weaponization subcommittee talked about this in the context of January 6th. What they were discussing is who was in Washington, D.C. near the Capitol on this day. What did they buy? The government went to Bank of America and all the large banks and said, hey, would you guys mind filing a suspicious activity report on anyone who withdrew money in D.C. on this day? And basically, the banks, fearing that they're going to lose their license or have fines, they complied and they gave all that information into the suspicious activity report database. And all of that, the FBI and all the other law enforcement agencies were able to get their hands on with no warrants, no judicial process, and they were going around the constitutional protections that our financial privacy would normally have. Now, when we talk about what this means for cryptocurrency exchanges, Bitcoin custodial solutions. It means that the Bank Secrecy Act has been weaponized against these other institutions and exchanges and liquidity partners. I mean, there's all kinds of apps and cool services that we have on Lightning to where people are unsure what the law is and they're just abandoning US users now. And that means that we're left without the greatest innovations, the cool stuff that we choose to seek out, for Bitcoin. We're not going to be able to use it. So we've seen the Bank Secrecy Act from 1970 with its very low thresholds kind of evolve after Patriot Act and all kinds of different revisions. And a lot of it is focused right now on the broader cryptocurrency market and different networks and for tracking where things are going. This is essentially at the heart of the Samurai Wallet case and also Tornado Cash, which are very important when we talk about non-custodial. And that's something that we're kind of litigating through court now, are non-custodial Bitcoin tools subject to Bank Secrecy Act or to registering for a money transmission license if they never have any keys, if you as the user are actually constructing the transaction. These are the questions that are being brought up in a sort of criminal trial. But again, these are very complicated topics. The Bank Secrecy Act has obviously been weaponized. It's not just because of Bitcoiners, but also Trump supporters, MAGA people know that from January 6th onwards, and it's the same in Canada, and it's the same. It could be for people who are protesting at anti-abortion rallies or something like that. I mean, there's all kinds of very seedy territory where we empower the government to try to get this information, and they're not using the legal process in order to do it.
Right, right. And I think, just having done a little bit of research on this, the original intent of the Bank Secrecy Act was to prevent illicit finance, if I'm not mistaken. And given what you just said, it seems like we may have strayed from that. So, to what extent have we sort of, lost the purpose here? And what are the sort of dangers of that?
Well, it obviously in the beginning it was a lot about organized crime, money laundering. You had a lot of dictators from around the world who would park their money in the U.S. and then send it back and fund regimes and do all kinds of terrible things. And when they passed it in 1970, that was the kind of idea: is let's figure out who these criminals are. Let's figure out how we're able to get to them, and let's have a legal process whereby we can get that information. Now, what started happening is that as governments, law enforcement agencies, different parts of the government were inquiring with banks and financial institutions, the incentive became that if you're a financial institution, a bank, a payment app, you will just provide more reports than you're being asked of, because basically you do not want to be caught liable for having money laundering or having any seedy behavior, criminal behavior that is being used through your bank or through your cryptocurrency exchange. And that means that every institution was just filing millions of reports. And the last study that was done on this was something like 99% of the reports, suspicious activity reports that were handed out and put into this FinCEN database, they had nothing to do with criminal activity. It was people buying boats. It was people paying rent. It was people sending money to their brother-in-law who happened to live in a different country. And that's kind of what happened, is that we created this dragnet, this huge database where, again, we don't have to use the typical Fifth Amendment rights, law and order process, asking a judge, having some kind of information, building a case. It was just that all this information was at the ready for anyone in law enforcement to use. So it really started going awry after that. There were a lot of excesses in post 2001 America when it came to the Patriot Act. Even your library records, is something that could be gotten without any kind of warrant. And then another one is we've had basically from the 1970s onward something that's known as the third party doctrine. And that is the idea that if you willingly give your information, your private data to some third party, you have no more reasonable expectation of privacy. And the courts have kind of sustained this time and time again. You do have Justice Neil Gorsuch, who's on the court now, Supreme Court Justice, who would be very willing to strike this down if the right case came about. And why this is important, again, is because If we look at, let's say, your cell phone tower, it's collecting information about your phone and who you're calling. The law enforcement agents and police and the government can just go directly to the cell phone company and get that information because you've willingly given it up in line with a third party discipline. So the idea that we kind of try to repeal that or firmly say that the Fourth Amendment should apply, I think is a really important change. And we should restore our financial privacy when it comes to our financial information as well. And that is only going to have very good effects for Bitcoin, people who use exchanges, people who use things like Cashew or Fedimints, all these different solutions. We would actually be able to restore a bit of our financial sanity and privacy. And I think that'd be a very good thing.
Right. And then, I think before we jump into the next thing, I do want to sort of underscore Senator Lee's Saving Privacy Act here. So, could you sort of give us an overview here? And I think that maybe there's a lot to dig into here, but yeah, just get that on the table for
Yeah,
us.
so the Saving Privacy Act is a bill that was written by Senator Mike Lee, a Republican from Utah. It's being co sponsored by Senator Rick Scott of Florida. And what this bill does is essentially tries to take all the teeth out of the Bank Secrecy Act only when it comes to these suspicious activity reports. So banks and financial institutions and cryptocurrency exchanges would still be required to have some kind of records of the transactions that are made that might seem suspicious. They're just not going to be required anymore if this bill passes to preemptively send that to the government, to the Department of Treasury. So that cuts down on the ability of the government to get access to your financial information if they don't have a warrant. So this is saving privacy in a very good sense. But the bill is very good. It's like a beautiful hodgepodge of many things that consumer advocates, privacy advocates would love. There are many circumstances in the bill where it talks about prohibiting a central bank digital currency, which is very important for many different reasons, requiring the government get warrants if they go after any of your financial information, creating a private right of action, getting rid of the Corporate Transparency Act, which essentially required that every LLC shareholder have to be doxxed to FinCEN as well. So it's a very comprehensive bill, but it is something that addresses the Bank Secrecy Act and the broader concerns that we have with Bitcoin and Bitcoin users, I think, very well. And I'm seeing a little bit more support now that is a bit more bipartisan, definitely in the age of figuring out post Trump, post House Weaponization Committee. A lot of people are discussing ways that we can make reforms with our financial surveillance systems. And I think Saving Privacy Act is a really interesting way of doing it, and it raises a lot of these issues, I think, in a responsible and constitutional way that really would make sense for a lot of Americans.
Yeah, yeah, I haven't dug too much into it, but from my cursory look, I think I'm with you on this. Um, okay, speaking about banking, and these do definitely tie together. Um, we've seen a massive sort of consciousness, uh, you know, around the debanking and Operation Choke Point 2.0. I think Nick Carter has been talking about this for a while, but it wasn't really until Mark Andreessen joined Joe Rogan to discuss this that it sort of came into the popular discussion. So, yeah, how does that fit in? Where are we on that? And do you see anything changing?
So we mentioned before the suspicious activity reports. If we look at, let's take Zach for an example. If Zach at Community XY Bank happens to have 20 suspicious activity reports to his name, you are at risk of what the bank calls offloading or de-risking. Basically, you've become too much of a risk for this bank to continue on because you're spending a lot of money, you're doing things, perhaps you're buying cryptocurrencies that things they won't like. So you've essentially become too risky for the bank to take on. And that is not because you yourself are doing something risky and that you might hurt someone or that you are a criminal, but just that you would run afoul of whatever regulations and stipulations of the Bank Secrecy Act and all of the other financial regulations imposed on financial institutions. So the idea of debanking, and this is a word that we're just kind of it's coming to the fore now, even though people have been talking about it for years. It's essentially people being pushed out of the financial system because the banks don't want to deal with the risk. And it has nothing to do with how much money you have. It has to do with the fact that those banks and financial institutions and cryptocurrency exchanges might be penalized if they keep you as a customer. Now, one part that I think is really gross of the Bank Secrecy Act is that the financial institutions, crypto exchanges, whatever it might be, they're not even allowed to tell you that they filed a suspicious activity report on any of your transactions. They're not allowed to tell you that. And then when they kick you out of your bank account, technically they're not really able to tell you why anyway. They'll try to come up with, legalese that's been looked at by their lawyers, but essentially they've debanked you because you're too risky and they would run afoul of whatever financial surveillance regulations exist. And I think the way that Andreessen was talking about it was just essentially many founders who are just related to cryptocurrency broadly. And we're seeing more reports now that have come from the FDIC, which is supposed to insure our bank deposits, but seems to have just really had it out for Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies, and essentially was chastising different institutions for even having so-called crypto customers. So this is definitely a policy, and it was one that was implemented at the very top, and it had to go out through the different agencies and organizations. And again, we're not in the business of arguing for everybody should get bank accounts, right? It's just that this stuff impacts Bitcoin. This stuff impacts your ability to get sats stacked using your own money that you made. And that's where I think many of us who are advocates on this stuff have to be loud about it, because it's not just about ordinary people having bank accounts and all, oh no, poor millionaire, he can no longer have his account. It's about ordinary people, because most people who are debanked are those who tend to be minorities, who tend to not have all kinds of different incomes, and they're the ones who don't have a voice. They can't go on Joe Rogan to talk about this stuff. So the principle matters. And the reason that debanking is such a big topic now is, yes, because it's harmed a lot of very big people, but much like all kind of monetary crimes and monetary repression that we all kind of feel in the fiat system, it's harmed the people least well off first. And thankfully, at least we're having a conversation about it. We'll see what happens with the new Trump administration. They definitely talk a very good game right now, but it's going to depend on what Congress can do before essentially that the whole balance of power gets out of whack, probably a year and a half in.
Right, and I think the other angle to add here is, the sort of innovation angle, which is to say that, and maybe this is similar to Andreessen's point, but even in the sort of Bitcoin space, there's stories of founders who are incapable of getting access to a bank account simply because they have Bitcoin in the name, or their articles of incorporation mention some kind of crypto or Bitcoin. And so, the banks won't even take them on as a customer in the first place. And, we also saw a number of banks that were serving, Bitcoin companies specifically, get basically taken down. Um, and so that, again, there's this element to which there's very strong, Bitcoin innovation, companies that are building on Bitcoin that, can't gain access to that critical infrastructure. And, that poses a threat too, as well.
Yeah, and
So
one other point with that, because you reminded me of it. A lot of the cryptocurrency exchanges do have bank accounts, because they have to pay employees or certain vendors, and the reserves that any cryptocurrency brokerage or exchanges are required to have, according to state and federal law, and per accounting practices, is actually pretty exorbitant. So they not only need to match, let's say they have 200 Bitcoin, they need to have the equivalent amount in fiat in their bank account ready to go, and then some. So this is a kind of precondition for getting that money transmission license in many of these different states. They need to have all of that money in Bitcoin, but also in fiat equivalent as well. And essentially, they have to use banks. And if banks don't want to bank with them because they have crypto or Bitcoin in their name, it's sort of a catch 22, and makes it so that you essentially become a criminal for trying to run, as you said, an innovative company. and offer innovative solutions to consumers and people who want to actually use this stuff and be able to convert some of their paycheck into Bitcoin. We've just kind of created all these terrible incentives. They really built up over time. And I think thankfully now we're having a kind of good, I hate the term like social discussion, but we're at least talking about it in broader terms than on, podcasts and Substacks. People are actually talking about it in the halls of Congress, and they're discussing it in mainstream media. And I think that's a pretty good sign.
Absolutely. All right. Now for the fun stuff. So I think there's this saying in the Bitcoin community that Bitcoin fixes this, right? Um, and I think to some extent it might be overused, but I feel like here there's this very reasonable parallel to draw that says, hey, this existing financial system, the banking industry, has all of these rules. It has all of these sort of nets that you have to jump through. Um, Whereas, Bitcoin doesn't have those, right? Anyone can use a Bitcoin wallet permissionlessly anywhere in the world, and you don't have to provide any information to anyone. So, yeah, I guess broad question here, like, how does Bitcoin fix this on the debanking issue?
Yeah, this is the kind of always chicken and egg is once you enter the Bitcoin system in the network and you have your seed phrase and you're well protected and you can sign transactions, you're free. You can go and spend your money wherever you want, do whatever you want, put out a QR code and people can send you money. Not a problem. The issue comes with the on and the off ramps. And that's where the government has put forth kind of all these different regulations to essentially trap what's happening between that exchange, Bitcoin to USD or USD to Bitcoin. And I think we just have to figure out a new way that people are able to A, accumulate and then B, trade in Bitcoin. I mentioned going to the barber before. So my barber, I've been giving him Bitcoin for I don't know how long, but he has that available and he's able to send that Bitcoin to his friends and family who might be living in a different country. He might be a dissident, who knows, whatever it might be. And they're able to use that. And that will probably have a lot of value, particularly in despotic regimes that have currency controls. And, oftentimes it's not even autocratic systems that have these currency controls. It's happened in Europe. It happened in Greece and Cyprus. People were not able to withdraw more than 400 euros basically per month in cash because they had a financial crisis. That's the kind of stuff that can happen to ordinary people and will happen. And I think that's why having access to an open protocol and network like Bitcoin does offer people that option. What's really been difficult, and look, I've been probably like many people listening, so-called orange pilling people for years, and it's hard. I think the tech is very advanced. I think the UX is sexy. I think it all looks great. It's just a lot of times people don't necessarily connect the two together, and I think this is especially a problem for the developed world. For the US and Europe, Canada, we have, pretty good payment apps that people can use if they want to pay their friends and reimburse them for dinner. They can use Venmo or PayPal or Cash App or whatever. It's the problem becomes, the actual currency that we're using and all types of questions about that. But in other places, they don't have the luxury of using all of these apps. They don't have the luxury of even being able to try to send their own money. Many of them can't even get the bank accounts in the first place so they could send their money digitally. So it brings up a lot of those different issues. And it's very empowering for people to use Bitcoin wallets, to understand what a seed phrase is, to use self custody. And we have to continue to advocate for that as well. There's a lot of very top heavy reforms in the sort of broader Bitcoin world, many of which I believe are directionally correct and awesome. Things like strategic Bitcoin reserve. And I would hope that if that does advance, we would get other reforms as well that empower people to use self custody, peer to peer payments, to able to use reasonably on ramps, off ramps, whatever it might be. But I think we have to continue pushing that message because it's dire times if people are scared away from using Bitcoin because of that.
Yeah, let's say more about this strategic Bitcoin reserve, and you can use that as you will, but and also speak about sort of what comes along with that. Like what is the sort of like symbolic meaning of a strategic Bitcoin reserve, and what does that mean for these other sort of incidental, I guess reforms you might say?
Yeah, it's interesting to talk about this because we, at least I think for Bitcoin advocates, we seem like we're like total and utter American nationalists, right? It's like we're talking about the strategic future of the United States and our capabilities and our capacity, and trying to be this world force. And I think that's why it is an interesting and unique proposal for the United States. Now, I've gone through many of these different things. I come from a more libertarian background, so I don't like the government doing much of anything. Surely not stacking sats that I think I should have. But what it really provides, I think, the strategic Bitcoin reserve is this directional movement of saying this government, this state has embraced what is the future of Bitcoin and all the financial innovation, economic empowerment that comes with it. We're taking a posture that is very positive on Bitcoin and everything that it provides, even though we cannot control the protocol, even though we cannot increase the supply, even though we cannot stop people making any kind of transactions if they're peer to peer. That right there is a huge vote of confidence in the network, in the protocol. That's like the equivalent power of 20 nuclear bombs worth of nodes coming online to say America is here. And I think that's what Bitcoin Act and the Strategic Bitcoin Reserve kind of it provides, is an opening. And one thing that we have to understand is in the permission structure of global public policy, America is always first. And people are going to choose, whatever America does on a particular technology, a particular app, some kind of policy. Many other countries are going to emulate that. So you can very much imagine that there will be this kind of race to the top rather than the bottom if the US puts out this strategic Bitcoin reserve plan, which again does not have to be too complicated. You can start with the Bitcoin that the government already has, and you don't let them sell it. You don't let them escape the hands of the treasury for now. So I think it's a interesting and good way to get people discussing not just the benefits of Bitcoin, but the benefits of Bitcoin for a society, a freedom loving people, and how it actually jives perfectly with our principles and our constitution and our way of doing things, and competition between currencies, competition between our system of government and others. I think the US government could do something really interesting with this, at the same time that we also propose some of these reforms to allow people to use it to get rid of the financial surveillance that kind of exists in the system today, and then allow people to use this as an alternative currency for the future.
Yeah, I think that's probably one of the lines of argument that resonates the most with me is this sort of like soft power projection, right? Like post Cold War, we're not fighting communism anymore, but we're spreading these sort of classical liberal values that I think that we at the Bitcoin Policy Institute like to think that Bitcoin really embodies. And today, let's see, this will come out next week. But today we're releasing a report. It's very short about how Bitcoin embodies sort of human rights and financial inclusion, and the extent to which like the U.S. establishing a strategic Bitcoin reserve would fulfill those purposes. So I guess like the question here is you're imagine you're a U.S. policymaker, in the federal government or a regulator. Like, to what extent does a strategic Bitcoin reserve sort of push forward that U.S. Strategic values on the sort of like human rights, freedom, those kinds of things?
Many of us have tried to make this kind of argument, particularly amongst progressives. And that's why there's a shout out to Progressive Bitcoiner podcast and website. I think they do a good job in emboldening those kind of values and talking about Bitcoin. For this, it's really interesting because we've tried to make many of these arguments in the past, and a lot of people who are involved in Bitcoin are they're not your anarcho-capitalists. Many of them are fairly left-wing. Many of them come from a completely different political persuasion, and they have viewed it in this realm of human rights and economic inclusion. And for those people who can't even get a bank account, who are forced to only use cash, who, maybe don't have the W-2 income statement to get an apartment and to put down a deposit, Bitcoin is an answer to that. And if you have a strategic Bitcoin reserve, it means that, look, the country as a whole, as policy, has embraced this technology and everything that it provides. And they're not going into it blind. The people who are going to be talking about Bitcoin, and even Trump, we have to say, who's been talking about Bitcoin more and more, he realizes it's not just an asset that number go up, forever green candles. It's also going to empower individual people because there's an entire technological revolution that's happening with open source software where people can run this on their own. And I think they can do a very good job at that. And especially the fact that it can't be censored, it can't be stopped. You cannot have any kind of dictatorial regimes telling people that they can't send or receive money. I think it's just very powerful. And especially for a lot of young millennials, people who, I'm sorry, but I'm not going to be able to buy $1 million house tomorrow. Maybe for the Zoomers, Generation Z, you guys are thinking the same thing. I have no idea if I'm going to be able to afford, a house and have the same American deal that my parents had. But what if we had a new American deal, and one that was about the promise of Bitcoin and the promise of decentralized technology and the promise of actually owning your own sovereign stack through self custody? I think that is going to be something that particularly young people are really going to like. And I think politicians should be, forgive the term, woke to that idea, because I think it's very helpful to the country and to individual citizens as well.
Okay, final SBR question here, and then, then we can get back on topic. Um, I think like one thing that we're hearing a lot right now is, the strategic Bitcoin reserve is basically just an excuse for powerful crypto and Bitcoin holders to transfer wealth. Um, and I think that is, again, like, as far as a public policy issue goes, we don't want that perception. That would be, I objectively think that would be bad for Bitcoin, if that's sort of the prevailing narrative, and then the SBR actually does get done. So what do you have any thoughts about sort of how to counter that argument? I wrote an article about this, so obviously I have my feelings, but yeah, like, do you see that as a problem, and if so, what do we do about it?
Yeah, I mean, Bitcoin is not some penny stock, right? We're not in Wolf of Wall Street in the beginning of the movie where he's like pitching whatever company that's in a garage. We're talking about a global asset that is owned by millions upon millions of people sovereignly. So when we talk about a strategic Bitcoin reserve, we're not aiming to get the government to embrace something that's totally alien. It's something that millions upon millions of people are using, and they're doing so because they see an advantage in it. It is free market money. It's something that has evolved naturally and through creative destruction. We have this asset that people are able to use if they want to with their traditional financial products, or this great technology that I can use on my nodes and servers and wallets that I might have on my phone. So I know that there's a lot of arguments about the future of US debt and essentially what we can do about it as a country. And again, again, Trump had some very interesting quips throughout his campaign. He talked about paying off $36 trillion with a little crypto check, by which he meant Bitcoin. I think that it's at least some kind of option. And it is something that, would be a risk in some way. But then again, the biggest risk is not getting in on it at all, because these other countries are thinking about it. A friend of mine who's a journalist in Austria, Nico Yilk, he went recently to Bhutan. In Bhutan, the entire government is orange pilled, and they're using their hydroelectricity to mine Bitcoin now. And they're doing it like basically, like, if you have to look at the graph, the power hash network, like Bhutan is kicking way above its weight. Why is it that the leaders in Bhutan understand this, but our own American leaders don't understand it yet? Many other leaders will continue to understand it. El Salvador is giving us an interesting example of what happens when a government not only embraces Bitcoin, but essentially becomes a mascot for Bitcoin. That is actually very hopeful, because El Salvador has much greener pastures today than they had 10 years ago. And pretty much we can line a lot of that with Bitcoin and the opportunities that have come to that country because they've embraced it. what can you imagine will happen once the US does the same? The amount of entrepreneurship, the amount of creativity, the amount of, finally strengthening our economic force as individuals, it just represents so much. Missing out on that, I think, would be very painful, be very sad. It'd be like that Microsoft shareholder vote, 99% to one. You'd be missing out. And I think we have a very good opportunity here. There's such a great, interesting momentum that could lead us to all these reforms that would make it better for even me as an individual user. I don't need the bags of any large Bitcoiner. I can actually profit from that tomorrow.
Wonderful. All right. As we're wrapping up here, I've got two more questions. The first is, um, to what extent is Bitcoin going to improve, on a sort of like regulatory front? Like, do we move forward because of, changes in the way that Bitcoin is treated by the government, or is this something that sort of do the largest benefits accrue when we just sort of write the code? To fix the things that maybe aren't working. So yeah, like what's the sort of highest ROI here? Is it regulation or is it just building?
Well, I know the privacy guys will hate me saying that. Better regulation will be good, but I think it doesn't hurt, and people really recoil at the term sort of regime certainty or fiscal certainty, legislative certainty, but it's something that's important. And that certainty is not just, oh, okay, I know I can do a Bitcoin business now. It's that, okay, the system is geared towards accepting Bitcoin and making it normal. We're normalizing it. So I think we are going to have some of these regulatory and legislative changes. We already have a House Finance Committee. We have incoming Representative French Hill, who will be the head of the committee. Super open to Bitcoin, all in, loves the crypto economy. Who would think that it was just like a Republican congressman from Arkansas that would be doing that? But he's very open to it. The incoming Trump administration, Secretary of the Treasury, Secretary of Commerce, even Vice President J.D. Vance himself is a Bitcoiner. You can look at his disclosures. So I think those those people who will have certain regulatory power are already acknowledging by the power of their own purse and their own stacking that they believe in Bitcoin. So I think that is just generally much better off. The last administration was very hostile generally, and we have a lot of incentives built into the system so that if you happen to work for the government, it's technically against ethics rules to have any cryptocurrency or Bitcoin at all, which we should obviously repeal. But if you have this sea change that comes in and people are embracing this, I think that relieving of regulatory pressure is definitely a good thing. I do think at the same time, Bitcoin builders still have to put out cool stuff that people want. I test out all kinds of different stuff, nodes and wallets, and some things are really disappointing, but some things are really awesome. Oh, cool. I can use, Lightning address here, or I can use Nostr to plug in. Like there's all kinds of great innovations people are doing. They don't necessarily need to have a green light from government, but if we can give everybody at least the heads up that we're trending in a positive direction, people are open to this, let's take risks again, that is a good thing. And I think we'll be much better off. And again, it doesn't have to come with government bill A or B. It's generally from an attitude, which I think will benefit a lot of this.
All right. You've hinted at this, but how exactly does the incoming Trump administration change things? We're coming up on what, a month out from the inauguration. What does this mean? What are the top priorities? And I guess like, does this change things?
Well, one interesting way of looking at it is Vivek Ramaswamy, who's co-chair, I guess, of the DOGE, unfortunate name, but Department of Government Efficiency.
Right.
One thing he's discussed is this Supreme Court decision, and that was in Loper Bright. And what that does is it overturned the Chevron doctrine, the idea that in any kind of legislative or judicial disputes, we should always default to what the agency says rather than the original written intent of Congress. Sounds very nerdy, legalese. What it actually means is that we strip back the power of our regulatory agencies to just go after people and go after companies and go after technologies, and to do so basically illegally or beyond the breadth of their power. So coming in, that's the attitude of many of the people in the Trump administration, that federal agencies on the whole have been way too active in the lives of Americans, whether it be their finances, whether it be their businesses, all kinds of different issues. The government has been way too loud and proud and involved. And instead of talking about ways of intervening in people's lives, we should be figuring out ways that we can free people from sort of the different tentacles of government. So I think that will be very important. I think Doge's idea of rolling back the regulatory state, which to Trump's credit, he already started during his administration. There's a lot of very smart people who were kind of working the machine, getting rid of stuff, trying to cut regulations. They were doing it in a really good way. Obviously, there's a lot of political issues and things that clouded all of that, but you're definitely going to have for Bitcoin a renewed focus. We're not going to have this regulation by enforcement, by uh, SEC, by Department of Justice. The FBI will not be willy nilly arresting Bitcoin developers, we hope. So there will be a kind of different attitude. People who use Bitcoin won't be viewed as, seedy actors. They'll be viewed as normal Americans practicing their liberties, whether it be financially, through speech. And I think that is a good positive change. So it might take a little while to have anything statutory. My estimation is the Trump administration has about a year and a half of like actual governing mandate before you have the midterm elections, then before you have like senators go out and then sea change against Trump. So we have about a year and a half of seeing where that change takes us. But having good, smart people who understand the limits of law and figuring out how law can harm individuals and entrepreneurs, I think will be a big change. So I'm cautiously optimistic.
I guess like to play devil's advocate here too, and I know I said that was my last question, but do you see anything sort of turning in the other direction here? Are there any things that you're, I guess, concerned about? Concerned about? Sorry.
No, you make a good point in that. The thing about Trump is he's a very polarizing figure. So anything that Trump does or says or that his government will try to do will be opposed by people, no matter if it's good. If he said he was boosting and doubling social security checks for everyone who's retiring, there'd be an outcry, even though that's like part of the Democratic platform. So I think that is a risk. And one thing at BPI that I think we advocate very well is that Bitcoin is nonpartisan. It's not really tied to one political party. It is, I think, helped by the American system and our philosophy of viewing things, but it should never be seen as that it's just one camp or one party. And so far, it's been really good because you've had a lot of Democrats who see the potential in this and they've discussed it and talked about it and they're very excited. And then you've had Republicans do the same thing. So I do think, and yeah, of course, I mean, I'm generally skeptical of government power anyway. So is something going to get messed up at some point? I have no doubt. But I think there will be this kind of pushback, generally from people in the administration, not because they're debating with the fundamentals of Bitcoin, but it's just that the messenger is bad. And unfortunately, that's just kind of how it is in politics. It's a dirty game. Those of us who play it for fun or for a job. So I think if we just have to be sure we have good messengers out there. That's why we do need to have very good policy advocates. We need people making all the different argumentations for strategic Bitcoin reserve or some of these other reforms. It can't just be government officials who will also be regulating, who gets to play in whatever women's sports or abortion or all these other very polarizing topics that have nothing to do with Bitcoin. It's going to be difficult. And that's why principled people who can make this case, it's ordinary people. And that's one great thing I love about the American system is that individuals really are empowered. And we do have a system and a government that is built to protect our individual liberties and also gives us a voice in order to say we also have a stake in this. So in that sort of, I'm always very long American project as I am long Bitcoin.
Wonderful. This has been great, Yael. Do you have any final thoughts before we jump?
No, I think that's very good. I would encourage people to look at the work of Bitcoin Policy Institute on all matters related to these reforms, Strategic Bitcoin Reserve, the peer-to-peer rights fund run by Zach Shapiro, our colleague, who's been doing a great job supporting the cases of Samurai Wallet and the developers there. Really integral case for Bitcoin and non-custodial wallets and tools. So I would encourage folks to go to that. Check out the talks from our much more intelligent and smarter than me fellows who deal with philosophy and Bitcoin and written a great book on that. So I definitely encourage that. And always keep in mind also the mining and the environmental sort of benefits of Bitcoin, which we've kind of we're not talking as much about right now, but could be more pertinent in the future. So that's all I got to say about that.
Absolutely. And just before we go, where can people find you if they're interested in your work?
Well, I'm on Noster, obviously, Yael at yael.at, or on the X, Yael OSS, and then kind of all over the social medias. But you can find me there, and I have my website where I've kind of listed these articles, and obviously I'm on the BPI website with important articles for Bitcoin policy. So always go there.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you so much, Zach. It was a pleasure.
See you later.